Hello and welcome everyone to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup post-election edition for Monday, November 11th, 2024. Ron Quaranta here with my amazing friends and co-hosts, David Brill and Josh Klayman. Before we begin, our usual disclaimers. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Please keep in mind, nothing discussed should be considered any type of investment or legal or accounting advice. Certainly when I joke about tokens, don't take anything I'm saying seriously. And then obviously everything that we're discussing are really our own personal opinions and do not necessarily represent the opinions of our firms. David, Josh, it's been an insane week. It is good to see you both. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm out here in Arizona on vacation. Got to see my Jets get pummeled yesterday, but that was the only bad thing in an otherwise tremendous week.
David, I want to share. Josh, can I talk about the power outage?
Yes, please do.
So there's this thing, David, that, you know, at your 15,000 square foot estate in Paradise Valley, Arizona, you may not have a problem with. But in New Jersey, where Josh and I live, sporadically on sunny days, barely a breeze, you'll lose power. No idea why. No idea what happened. But Josh, David, it's good to see you both. Let's dive right into it. So last week we had the presidential election in the United States, as well as several Senate and House races. Many of the House races are still waiting to be called. I think we're down to 14 of those races that are in very, very thin razor margins. David, Josh, we generally don't get into the politics of it per se, but the markets, globally, particularly in the United States, have had an amazing reaction. David, let's start with you. Were you surprised by the results of the election? Are you surprised at the crypto market's reaction to the election?
So going back to last week's podcast, I'm collecting my receipt here for having picked the Republicans to win the presidency and to win the Senate. So collected that receipt. No, I'm not surprised. I think I'm a little surprised at the popular vote and the amount of victory that Trump had over Harris, but I had expected. And really, like I mentioned before, I really had a lot of faith in the betting markets. And I felt that these type of markets really were better predictor than the polls.
Yeah.
And I think that bore out in the election. So no, I wasn't surprised. I really thought the Republicans would win the Senate, but the amount of the victory and the potential win in the House is a surprise to me.
David, thank you. Josh, were you surprised? And for the record, for everyone watching us, David and Josh and I text regularly. But I'm still, Josh, I want to hear your thoughts. Were you surprised at kind of the lopsidedness of it all?
You know what? I'm kind of with David. I was rewatching, by the way, before this, not immediately before, but I was watching our podcast from last week, or the one prior to the election. And one of the things we were talking about is it possible that there is a manufactured closeness in the election that had been going on in the press, right? To try and say it's neck and neck. And David had, and I believe you as well, Ron, you guys have been saying, well, the prediction markets, may be a better predictor because people are really putting their money where their mouth is. And sure enough, that came to be. So in terms of what's going on in the market after the result, no, I'm not surprised about that at all either. I mean, I think we were predicting, whatever. We were playing around with the idea that no matter, I was trying to stay away from anything that might sound like advice because this is not advice. But the idea was anything was better for crypto than our current administration, right? So that there would possibly be a bump anyway, no matter which way it went. But I think we all expected a pop if there was a Trump presidency, and we've seen it. We're still seeing it today.
Josh, David, thanks so much. I agree with you, and we've had these conversations many times before. David, you kind of alluded to something that you and I have spoken about, and I know there's a lot of, from some folks in the marketplace, this disdain around prediction markets, and there are certainly some regulatory challenges that have been raised, for example, at the CFTC level. I think at its core, there really is a wisdom of the crowds type of mentality to this, and there's certainly challenges. I find it pretty ironic, David. I think a week or two ago, some news outlets had reported, oh, well, all of these trades at prediction markets are wash trades. It's not real activity. I don't buy that interpretation of it, David. I think the prediction markets, and I love your opinion, really do represent that wisdom of the crowds in some way at a more granular level. Is this the death of polling?
So I don't think it's a death of polling, and I think there was some unfortunate kind of hit pieces from
Mm,
mainstream media trying to downplay the relevance of these prediction markets. But no, look, we've seen in the betting markets generally,
yeah.
like if you look at sports betting, they have this tremendous skill about setting lines for games, and then the games, whether it be the amount scored or who wins, are very close to those lines.
Yeah.
And I think that same logic can be, you know, projected into these betting markets for other things, elections, and in Europe, in the UK, they have betting,
Mm,
these betting markets for quite a while, and a whole host of different, whether it be elections or other current events. And so no, and I think the prediction markets are really good about outcomes, states. So when I made our prediction last week, I felt comfortable based off of the aggregate of the prediction markets I looked at that they would be on point. And I think more of them will be looked to as a resource going forward. The last thing I want to say is,
yeah.
for polling, you have a couple of things at play here. First of all, not everybody wants to tell people who they're going to vote for.
Yeah.
Second of all, a whole swath of the populace isn't going to talk to the pollers in the first place.
Yeah.
And third of all, depending on how you ask the question, you can come up with a poll in a way that sort of suits what you're trying to get at on a sort of micro issue.
Yeah.
So I think the three combined, are challenges to getting polls that are really uh, on point, and more so on point than our prediction market.
And David, we saw that, and again, the politics or political affiliations aside, there was a pretty prominent Iowa poll that showed Vice President Harris ahead 10 points. That turned out to be patently incorrect. David, I want to push back on the polling comment that I made, and Josh, please weigh in. I'd love your perspectives on it. I sort of do think polling is dead, or at least polling as we know it. And the reason I'm going to say this, David, Josh, polling's been wrong at least the past two presidential cycles, notably wrong. And the antiquated way that a lot of polling takes place really doesn't account for, David, to your point, they don't want to talk to pollsters, or they may not indicate they're voting for a particular candidate. And driving 500 people to a website or knocking on doors, that's no longer a 21st century way of collecting that information. But prediction markets might. Josh, same question to you. Am I wrong, or is polling dead?
I mean, there are people who make their livelihood on polling, so I don't think it's
Fair.
entirely dead. But what I would say is, this whole idea, when you think of what polling could be or should be, it's to assess what is. Whereas I think what we've been seeing with a lot of these elections is polling being used to influence what will be. And so I think maybe in that sense, it's dead. It seems like the polls for people coming out of the election, right, the exit polling, seemed more reflective of what the ultimate result was. But I do think, again, going back to what we talked about prior to the election, it seemed to me that there was some potentially a manufactured closeness. It's neck and neck. It's neck and neck. Well, it evidently wasn't neck and neck. And I think that's another interesting thing. It makes me think a lot about what you guys have talked about previously in terms of the labor markets and people's actual lived experiences and inflation and stuff like that. Because, depending on where you were after the election results, people showed almost no surprise to, on the other side, tons of surprise. I mean, definitely being in New York City, just my experiences in the elevator bank, random locations, not necessarily the elevator bank of anything in particular, but just people's, conversations seemed like truly surprised. And certainly if you look at different, whether on Facebook or people, elsewhere, in some markets, there's incredible surprise. And then in others, the lived experience and the expectations were quite different.
It makes me wonder, Josh, how much of the populace is caught in the bubble of these kind of manufactured data points or information. You see it on the right, you see it on the left, and there's this sense of lacking perspective. And again, all due respect to everyone on either side of the political spectrum, it's difficult to understand what news is reporting when it seems to be reporting in a bubble on any side of the political spectrum. David, we're going to have a policy update with, shout out to Adam Goldberg and to Dina Ellis. We're due for a policy update. We'll have them on soon. But But David, one other thing politically, I was surprised at the blue wall essentially falling. You and I have seen, the three of us have seen many, many elections. That was tried and true for the Democratic Party for a couple of decades minimum. Were you surprised by that, David?
No.
Tell me why.
And it's something we harped on this podcast a number of times.
Yeah.
Inflation and the effect on the low and middle income workers is considerable, and it really wasn't reflected. I think that the Democratic side did a very poor job of, really understanding that a lot of people are really having trouble getting by, and the rise in costs, regardless of why there was a rise in costs, really was a problem. And, what are you going to do about it? And I think a lot of this vote was a vote against the status quo.
Yeah.
So no, I wasn't surprised. I think there were sort of three issues that, and we have to remember also, a lot of us, like, we're on, the East Coast. I'm on the Southeast Coast. You two are on the Northeast Coast. The views from the coasts are substantially different than the views from the middle of the country and how they're affected. So, no, I really wasn't surprised. I think the polling, it's interesting. I think, Josh, you said it. I think the polling was sort of misrepresenting the closeness of it, because I think if we had looked in the totality of things and what were important to people in the exit polling from this election, it was what we talked about. It's the economy, stupid. And it was the economy. And so, no, I wasn't surprised.
David, to that point, it's interesting. And I think it was on Bloomberg Radio. Shout out to Bloomberg. There was a post-election analysis, and it spoke specifically about inflation. And the commentary was that middle income or lower middle income voters, the average Americans out there, don't pay attention to Fed Chair Powell commentary on CPI. They do pay attention to the price of milk. And that was the thing that really swayed a lot of voters. Josh, let me pull you into a conversation we started earlier today. You, as chair of our legal working group, we brought up something with a new administration coming in. One of their talking points, and there's hyperbole for every administration that's coming in, was firing the SEC chair day one. Let me rip up the script, Josh. I think you and I are of like mind on this. He can't do that, can he?
I mean, my understanding is that the term continues to run for Gary Gensler. My understanding also is that typically or often SEC chairs may step down ahead of time just so that the next administration can move on. But I don't think that there is a way. I mean, perhaps there is if there's like nefarious activity or something like that. I really don't know. But absent that, I think the statement of firing Gary Gensler on day one, I think that's a non-starter under at least what I understand to be the legal requirements. Nevertheless, there are others who are closer to this, and David, you may be one of them.
So I think he could be demoted to be just a commissioner and not the chairperson. Yeah. But my crystal ball thinks that he will be resigning by the end of the year.
And there is already the Twitter sphere rumor mill that he will be stepping down before the end of the year. David, for everyone in the audience who may or may not know the importance of the role of the chair, because the chair solely sets the agenda for the Securities and Exchange Commission, correct?
Well, I mean, look, in the aggregate, it's done by all the commissioners, but the chairperson is driving that agenda and, is probably the ultimate say on that. Yeah. Look, I think there was an overwhelming mandate here that the current policies and the way that the commission is operating regarding our sector is not what the will of the people want, both in the voting in the election and in, comments made post that. And, I really think, and I think I want to really hear all of your opinions, but I really think that there's going to be a real sea change in how the commission deals with the crypto industry going forward.
David, I agree with you. Look, there's no shortage of commissioners at the SEC who have raised these issues around defining how they approach an entire industry. And this is public information. Commissioner Peirce, Commissioner Ueda, and their dissents, for those in the audience who haven't had a chance to read those really well-reasoned dissents, I agree with you, David, that that approach will change. But, Josh, one of the other things we mentioned earlier today, and we talk about it often, the three of us, I want the crypto. I would hope the crypto industry understands that all of the stuff the SEC has done to this point doesn't vanish overnight on inauguration day, right? There are cases that are ongoing. You can't, presumably, you can't call up all of those courts across those different districts and say, yeah, we take it back. We don't want those cases to move forward. Josh, there was even a conversation, shout out to Klayman Sadeghi and some others of the legal working group on private litigation issues. How do you see that evolving as a new administration comes in? What are the possibilities for those court cases?
I mean, well, some things, the ball's already rolling. And
Right.
the thing is, I would say, and I defer to the litigators out there, and certainly what you mentioned about Kayvon calling to our attention the importance of the plaintiff suits and the plaintiff's bar. I mean, one of the things we have to think about is no matter what the SEC does, courts, you could have judges that have taken a particular view, right? And perhaps there may be less aggressive enforcement. One can only hope. I believe that there will be. But to the extent that the ball is already rolling, I mean, we already have on the horizon, the Ripple appeal and things like that, and cases that are out there. We already have heard from certain judges, including, Judge Rakoff in the Southern District, who has taken a particular view. So I think to the extent that the wheels are already in motion, we may see some decisions. Hopefully, they'll be favorable for the industry, but I don't think things will just immediately grind to a halt. That being said, I mean, and I think we talked about this last time as well, but I'm seeing it in practice too. It appears that the SEC may be shoring up, workload for the future, just in terms of certain approaches, without going into too much detail.
No, Josh, that's a really good point. Really appreciate it. David, Josh, one other thing, though, when we look at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and again, I don't want to minimize CFTC and OCC and all of the other regulatory agencies that really do play into the crypto dialogue. But, talk about SAB 121. I'm going off script, David, but there's the possibility under a new administration, that being said, as a staff accounting bulletin, that might potentially be rescinded. Do you see that happening?
Well, sometimes you read my mind a little bit, but yes, I'm actually working for FTI. I'm going to put together a sort of, and maybe also we'll do it for the WSBA, a list of things that, looking into the crystal ball for 2025. And in my crystal ball for 2025 is the repeal of SAB 121 and, putting some legislation or putting a bulletin in place that will allow for a more fair and equitable way for companies to custody crypto and sort of account for it on its books. So, yeah, that is one of my predictions for 25 that I believe will happen.
Josh, am I wrong?
So I agree. I mean, if you think about what happened before with SAB 121, with a less friendly to crypto Congress than we have now, there was a vote to end it. And it was actually the Biden administration's veto that pulled it back. So I think SAB 121 is not going to be with us for that much longer.
And it's a quick win, I think, Josh and David, from the perspective of a new administration. David, I cut you off. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I really wonder what President Biden's motivation was to sort of get out ahead of it, especially when you had bipartisan viewpoints on it, why he got ahead of it and said he would veto it. I think if he had an opportunity to replay that, it might have been really helpful to him and then Vice President Harris for them not to veto it and maybe propose amendments to it if they felt necessary, but not veto it. Because I really think that hurt the Democrats when it came to the idea that there was a willingness to work with the industry when there was something that there was bipartisan support for that they just summarily vetoed without really probably looking into all the basis for what it was looking to do.
David, let me stay with you on this, and Josh, let me again, we're going political simply from the perspective of understanding the chess pieces on the board. David, in a Senate that has less Elizabeth Warren weighing in on financial matters and financial markets, and kind of influencing the executive branch's policy. How do you see opponents of crypto, the Warrens of the world? Sherrod Brown lost the election for a
Yeah.
Senate seat in Ohio. Has that anti-crypto army kind of fallen apart because of the election?
I mean, I think it's diminished significantly. I think Elizabeth Warren's a little bit of on an island now, and since there'll be a Republican administration, she's not going to have any sway over that administration.
Yeah.
I mean, according to John, when she was debating John Deaton, she's all for, she said, allowing people to buy crypto and sell crypto, just do it in a way that protects, consumers. I think her message is lessened significantly. I think there won't be blocks on bringing legislation to the Senate. I don't think there will be an ability to stop confirmations of a new SEC chair, or if they decide to go with interim appointments. Obviously, in that case, there isn't an ability to veto those. So I think it's a significant downgrade in the ability to stop meaningful crypto legislation from going forward. But also, I think, again, it's the will of the people. We have a new Senate. Sherrod Brown was defeated. The sort of the politicians who were anti-crypto, people use their, votes, and, there's some expressions escaping me, but basically they got out to vote and they made their voices heard. And ideally, their voices will be heard.
Josh, do you agree with David's perspective? And yeah, tell me your thoughts, please.
So I absolutely do. And I think it's a sign of the times when we think of somebody who has been anti-crypto all over social media. We've got John Reed Stark, right? Formerly, I believe, of the SEC, right? Who normally has been, really not mincing any words with his thoughts about the industry and his, criticisms. And if you read what he posted yesterday, I'm just going to read an excerpt from it. It says, the SEC's war on crypto is officially over. Here's what will happen next at the SEC and precisely how the SEC's crypto enforcement onslaught will grind to a screeching halt. The stark reality is that the people have spoken and the SEC should stop their crypto enforcement efforts immediately. Take some time to study the digital asset industry. The SEC will refer to their plan as a, quote, pause to study innovation, end quote, and dismiss or settle most, if not all, of the current crypto litigation. Chair Gensler should resign in the coming month or so and allow the new administration to move forward as they see fit. President Trump's victory was a mammoth landslide, and it should be respected. To the moon, I guess. Like, what? Is this a parallel universe?
Josh, would you or I have ever thought we'd hear those words from John Reed Stark when we started in this industry? Ever?
When we started in the industry, or even like a month ago?
Like a month ago. Yeah, exactly. Just a month ago.
I did not see that as I was reveling in my being at the Jets game yesterday, but not really reveling because they got crushed. But I think if we had seen that previously, we would have wondered if it was on April 1st that we saw it and not a regular day of the calendar. But I will say that I agree with most everything he said there. I mean, look, I think there is some fraud in the industry, and being aggressive to prevent those frauds, or if they're hacks, that's what they should be focused on. And we want them to be focused on that. We don't want to see people taken advantage of. But I think that we will look back at this time and the cases being brought and really realize that there've been so much money that's been spent and wasted fighting cases that shouldn't have been brought.
David, Josh, thank you both. I want to share, I have, and I'm sure you both do as well, we all have friends across every part of the political spectrum, right, left, and center. And I certainly have a couple of very left colleagues and friends who had mentioned to me, and I'm paraphrasing, well, crypto bro dark money through the crypto super PACs bought the election. I find that statement stunning, and it might be more provocative than I mean it to be for this live stream, David and Josh. But this is from people who less than a year ago said crypto is not worth the time. It's too insignificant and it's only used for illicit activity. Now it's buying elections. David, how much truth do you, or Josh, same question to you, how much truth do you believe is in that statement from opponents of crypto?
I think I have some sour grapes for them to eat. Look, every industry fundraises and actively works to, protect or to lobby their positions. And the crypto industry, and this is something like we all talked about this and we all participated in it for years. We've been going to Washington for a number of years to educate different members of Congress and their staffs on crypto and the benefits of it. And this was the culmination of a lot of work that the WSBA has put in, Fairshake has put in,
Yep.
other trade associations in crypto have put in the time and the effort to talk about our positions, talk about what we'd like to see for legislation, and to lobby, therefore. And so, no, I think that, no offense to your friends, I've heard so many different reactions about this election, and just really regarding crypto, it's an industry that's grown and matured, that has taken active positions into lobbying for what they want to see happen. And we're very tactical and successful in using the money they raise to affect change.
Josh, on the same point, I'd love your perspectives on it. And for the record, I don't really know anyone in the industry who uses the phrase crypto bros anymore. So it was interesting for me to hear that. But Josh, weigh in. What are your perspectives?
So not being a crypto bro, I would just say, a few things. One is, as David noted, lots of people put money towards the election,
Yep.
right? And the idea that crypto stole the election, crypto pushed the election. I mean, we all thought that perhaps crypto might be a wedge issue or perhaps something more than that, or the financing, right?
Yep.
But let me just say, as far as I know, the Harris administration had a lot of money behind it, right? Like
Right.
Kamala Harris inherited all of that money that was that had been pledged toward Biden, and then there were fundraisings afterwards. So, I mean, I somewhat agree with what David was saying about potentially sour grapes. That being said, I will say, and I think it's important probably to say for purposes of this, we're looking at things from really a crypto perspective, and
Sure.
the effect on an industry. Totally understand that many people have concerns. They feel strongly in both directions about this election, and everything from foreign policy to social
Sure.
things. So I understand that many people were shocked. Many people were not shocked, but I think crypto is often an easy scapegoat for people.
Yeah.
That's very true, Josh. And to that point, I remember the three of us maybe 6 months ago talking about crypto's impact on the election, and I very specifically remember saying, well, maybe the sub 1% difference in these tight races. Now the perception is, oh, super PAC money from crypto bros like tilted the election. There's a lot more we'll parse over this. We'll have definite policy updates. We still have, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's 10 or 14 different House races still to be settled. I believe a lot of them in California. We can even have a conversation at some point on how much of California counties moved right in some of the election, which was really, really interesting to see. David, let's pivot a little bit to the macro conversation. In the midst of all of the news about the election, of course, the Fed had a quarter-point rate cut on Wednesday, I believe it was. The markets seemed pleased with it, and it was also part of a conversation around, well, what if incoming President Trump fires you? And allegedly, and I didn't see the press conference, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said he can't or something. David, from an interest rate outlook perspective, how much of that tuned into where crypto prices went in the past week? And how many more interest rate cuts do you think we'll see?
So I do think we'll see one more this year, another 25. This is kind of a contrarian answer, but this would be one time where I felt like the rate cut wasn't really that important. I think the idea that on a macro level that we were going to have an administration that really wants crypto to flourish in the US, that is looking in the first 100 days to enact either legislation or move, whether it be with appointments of commissioners and such, really move this industry forward, is really what's been generating this interest and buzz and sort of moving our industry forward and moving prices forward. I think the one thing that's interesting is that bond rates are going up and we're cutting interest rates. So it's a very unique dynamic, and you don't usually see that. And so I think, in fairness to President-elect Trump, I think we need to give everything a little bit of time. Let him talk about what what his action items are, what are his priorities are, and sort of then take a step back and look at the interest rates and the rate cuts. I think in a vacuum, it's lumpy. It's really hard to do that without getting a more broader view of what he actually plans on doing. And then the other thing I'll say is, I'm just super curious to see if we see more uh, changes in the last few months, numbers being reported and revisions, and if there are significant revisions.
David, it's interesting, and Josh, I would love you to chime in here. You've heard more macroeconomic stuff from us than I thought you ever thought you'd hear in your life.
I love
David,
it.
the yield curve is no longer inverted.
Yeah.
And, from an economic growth perspective, that's relatively speaking a good thing, but long dated bond yields are going up pretty significantly. I'm going to throw out something, David, that might be more provocative again from a macro perspective, but there are some economists saying we're underestimating inflation in the core of the numbers, and sometime next year they're going to raise interest rates, which would arguably put a brake on economic activity. David, are they wrong?
It really comes down to your view of what tariffs may be. What are the size of them? How are they used?
Yeah.
Will they be used, and will they come into play? I could see a world where the tariffs that we had when President Trump was in office, we revert back to those. But there may be places where we subtly or not so subtly talk to certain countries and say, look, we have these tariffs on the table. We think there are actions you can take to prevent us from going ahead with these tariffs, and really using them as a negotiating tool.
Yeah.
So I think we really need to see how things play out before we take a more profound view on where rates are going.
David, thanks so much for everyone. Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I had read that, and you guys know far better than I do, but that there have been 4 more rate cuts poised for 2025, but that those, they might not be on the table necessarily, depending on how this tariff situation unfolds, with some suggesting that could be tantamount to a sales tax or have effects on inflation, as you guys were saying. So I think that's, I don't know. There's an interesting article out that talks about the Fed's next several decisions being much tougher than its most recent 25 basis point.
It's a really good point, Josh. Appreciate it. And for everyone who's joining us on LinkedIn and X and YouTube, if you've got questions for David or Josh or I, please put them in the chat. Really looking forward to answering some of those questions. David, last point on that. When we look at the Fed, and when we look how interest rates are moving forward, we often hear the Fed is data dependent. I think you agree with me. My argument has always been it's backward looking data dependent, which means in a vibrant economy, the data they react to is already old data. Is that incorrect, David?
No, I look, I agree with it. And one of the things I think we would benefit from is, putting some resources to upgrading the way we collect data, and maybe rethinking what those data processes are.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say something that's a little controversial, but I think it's something we really need to consider. And I think it is, as a country, if we're willing to onshore more jobs and more manufacturing that are being done offshore, is there a willingness of individuals to pay a little bit higher prices to do that? Because our labor costs here are higher than probably anywhere else, whether it be because of unions or just standard of living and things like that. But I could see a world where these tariffs and changes are presented in a way that, we're going to bring these jobs back to the US. Yeah. There are going to be higher prices because of that, but there's a higher benefit to the country that these jobs are here and not somewhere else. And that is something I could see as a real dialogue and conversation piece in next year.
And you could see a lot of folks have already made the conversation about the national security angle of ensuring jobs, particularly for things like AI chip development, for example. When I don't know what the percentage, David or Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, something like the vast majority of AI-enabled chips are manufactured in Taiwan, for example, or somewhere in the Asia-Pacific region, which, given current geopolitical climate, is a bit challenging for some people. important stuff. And again, it really comes down to, we keep hearing about tariffs, but like what is actually implemented, I think is the key. And it'll be many, many months before we know what that is. Josh, go ahead. Josh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, anecdotally, I mean, I have heard from people that certain companies have decided, to proceed differently because of perceived supply chain issues that are in the pipeline with respect to, and having to do with U.S.-China relations.
Right.
So I think that's something to watch as well. I do think, interestingly, to me at least, because I do watch the mortgage rates and things like that. And since we sometimes talk about what the effect would be on regular people, to contrast that with others, I had been reading that from the time of the 50 basis point rate cut by the Fed, that actually every week since then, although I haven't checked for this week, the mortgage rate has been climbing, the 30-year mortgage rate. And it's because it tracks the treasuries, which have been going up because of all of what you guys have been discussing.
Right. Yeah, the long did, it's interesting. And Josh, that brings us to a point we've raised. Fed cuts interest rates and people are surprised. How come credit card rates haven't come down, or car or auto payment rates haven't come down? Or to your point, why are mortgage rates moving up? It is difficult for those actions by the Fed to percolate through all aspects of the economy. And we've got to remember, for the better part of almost 20 years, David, we had essentially zero interest rates.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I would even go so far as that maybe this administration takes a view of, if there's critical infrastructure, supply chain things that we need in this country, that maybe they make a private-public partnership where, whether it is like an investment or grants or something where, we want certain things made here, and maybe we get into partnership with business, help fund maybe some of the R&D or some of the building of like semiconductor plants or otherwise, so that the U.S. government has access to these materials for U.S. citizens. Like that's not a terrible thing either. I wouldn't personally have an issue, as long as it's structured properly, for the U.S. to be investing in semiconductor plants or chip plants and receiving like the first right to buy for the government or things like that. I think that would be a creative way to deal with some of these things and bring more high quality jobs to the U.S.
Yep. David, Josh, thank you both so much. I'm sure we'll be covering the election for the next several weeks, if not months, depending on how policy evolves. Josh, I want to bring it back to kind of the day-to-day of folks like the three of us and so many colleagues that we know, going off script again, in the day-to-day of the crypto world. Let me ask you, the clients that have crossed your desk, and David, same for you at FTI, have many of them been waiting for election results? And have you seen a pickup in new activity, or how is that panning out post-election for the, without giving names specifically, for the work that you both do? Josh, let's start with you.
So I would say, and I have said in the past, there are a number of large-scale plans that had been keyed off of like the next move. Like, okay, we will proceed with this if former President Trump becomes President-elect Trump, like, because that will, that's a go. The other way, maybe a no-go. So yes, I would say for very important large-scale things, that is something that is driving. But I would say even just across the board, I mean, it's not just been Bitcoin that has been soaring, or just Bitcoin and Doge, right? Many others have. Yeah, I mean, rising tide lifts all boats, or almost all boats. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity across the board, because I think we're all true believers, and builders are true believers. But some of the rest of the economy is a bit fickle in terms of whether they think, crypto has legs. Hopefully everyone realizes it does now. But I just think people follow the money. And right now, Ron, it's looking like you might win your bet.
We've got a long way to go, but I was very, very hopeful post the election. Josh, you said it really, really well, that kind of go, no-go decision. David, at your perch at FTI, have you seen a lot of clients, to the extent you could speak about it, having that go, no-go decision around what happens with the election?
So I think a lot of it relates to clarity. And also, like, let's not forget that this current SEC has been sending out subpoenas and Wells notices to various companies throughout the ecosystem. So it's not just individual projects, but there's subpoenas that have gone out to investors in those projects, whether they be VCs or, well, probably not so many family offices, but, VCs that invested and purchased tokens. I won't say invested, who contributed to purchase tokens and projects and then sold them later. And, there have been the subpoenas out there. So I think that chilled some of the willingness to invest in new projects. So I think it looks like, with sort of regime change at the SEC, that's something that may not be a focus. I think what's really important is that this will give more clarity to the non ethers and Bitcoins of the world. And so all of these other tokens that have their status amongst, at the commission up in the air a little bit, I think there's more comfort level to look at those projects and say, look, there is this moment in time where this exists, but, we feel more confident now that this will get resolved and that, these entities will be freer to look at those and potentially invest in those token projects.
David, to that point, I think it's a really important conversation. Price action aside and election results driving up market prices aside, I think we still widely agree within our ecosystem, use cases matter. Yeah. So when you look at the tokens we're talking about and why we certainly don't recommend or any kind of investment advice, to all of the folks out there, Josh, you've said it many times, we all have builders keep building. The use cases for those tokens matter. And it's always a warning to people buying tokens. Be careful what you're buying. If you don't understand the use case, there's the chance that you're getting caught in a hype cycle. Josh, David, thank you both so much. Let's talk about that price action. David, Josh opened the Pandora's box of a Bitcoin-based steak dinner. I think, David, you and I were talking about it earlier. What's that?
You can smell it now.
Yeah, Josh is the ultimate winner of whatever
really
happens with this wager. But David, let me ask you this: is Bitcoin overbought when we look at a technical perspective?
No, and for all the audience, I want to tell everybody that I sent Josh and Ron a funny meme from one of my favorite lines from a Jim Carrey movie, and it's like, "So you're telling me there's a chance?" And it's really funny. You see Jim Carrey's big face with the buck teeth in this character he plays, and it was great. So I had to send that to Ron and Josh. I'm still feeling very confident, Ron, that we will not hit 125 by the end of the year.
Yep.
I am not surprised by the price action. I think we talked about that. We might see, an all-time high for Bitcoin at the end of last week after the election with a Trump win. And I think what we're seeing is follow through. And what I really think is interesting is the other thing that we all talked about is that we all had said that if once we saw an all-time high in Bitcoin, that people who hadn't been, especially retail who hadn't been involved, were going to start wanting to get involved. And I think that's also going to go to institutions that may have been on the sidelines who are now, and there's kind of FOMO in different ways. There's the FOMO amongst like, oh, you got in early, the smart people got in early and I want to get in before it's too late. And then on the institutional side, there's a competitiveness to returns. And so, some entities are going to have really nice returns this year based on investing in Bitcoin and Ether or other crypto, and some won't. So I think some people will not want to miss the alpha and come in a little later to the party. And I don't even think right now it's too late, by the way. We're not giving, investment advice, but I do think that there is a significant amount of upside that's still to come in the market. So I think we're really seeing, a cycle now where, that we're in price discovery. We've reached the all-time high and we're sort of seeing where price can go.
Josh, thank you, David. Thank you so much. Josh, are you surprised at Bitcoin touching 85,000 this morning?
I mean, listen, I think we've been waiting a long time for this. Yeah. Like, what were we? We were at like 60 something or 60 back in 2017 when we had the Bitcoin futures, right? So we finally made some ground. And while, yes, definitely this is way better than how it was where we were sub 20 following FTX, I think, right? So much better. But in the long run, this is something where I think it seems reasonable. I do hope that we get to higher heights. And I know eventually, in my view, we will. Whether it's by the end of the year, it's another story.
Hmm.
But I do think also what's interesting, with this lawsuit that where FTX has now sued
Yes.
Binance, right? I wonder if we'll see more of this in light of the price action with Bitcoin, because certainly to the extent that creditors or customers, right, have dollarized claims,
Right.
right, that now they don't necessarily have the benefit of the pop here of amounts that exceeded what they were at the time of the FTX bankruptcy. For those who aren't aware, it's been announced that FTX, on behalf of the creditors, has brought suit against Binance and certain principals be, on the idea that when Alameda repurchased shares in FTX from Binance, that Alameda was insolvent, right? So it
Right.
shouldn't have that should be able to be clawed back. So I wonder whether we'll see additional sorts of suits like that. Would love to hear your thoughts, guys.
And Josh, just to wrap that up for folks in the audience, we're talking. I think it's just under $2 billion that FTX
Yeah.
is suing for. David, to that point that Josh is making, when I hear about dollarized settlement for creditors, and knowing that some of these creditors purchase some of these cryptos at 16, 18, 20,000 per Bitcoin, and will never be able to participate given the settlements that we're seeing, how does that weigh on those creditors, David?
Oh, look, it's really tough.
Yeah.
I was a proponent to the extent possible of paying people back in their crypto and not in cash or in dollarized. And again, you saw the SEC jump in and object to that. Now, there wasn't enough money in the estate for everybody to be paid back in crypto, but it was my view that to the extent that people could be paid back in crypto on a pro rata share, that they should have been. And I still believe that. Look, I think we're also forgetting that I don't know when exactly the creditors will get back somewhere near 11 billion in fiat FTX holders, and I believe that's supposed to be in this fourth quarter that they will get their 11 billion back, and maybe it may be, in early January for tax purposes that they get that back. So that'll be a nice chunk of liquidity.
Yeah.
Also I want to give some perspective for everybody. Like I'm just taking a quick look here, but Bitcoin is at an all-time high, which is great. But Ethereum is really, the all-time high in Ethereum is, I see it here at like around 48.60, could have been a little bit higher. But right now at Ethereum, we're only at 33.20. So, we're still far, far away from the all-time high in Ethereum. So I do think there's an opportunity with a number of the larger crypto projects that we've all followed.
Yep.
There's a lot of room for them to go back to where they were at an all-time high. So I don't think as a whole ecosystem we're at an all-time high. It's really Bitcoin's at an all-time high. And I think, as Josh made the point, we were there a couple of years ago. I mean, and this past summer we really, it really was buy in May and go away, or sell in May and go away. And we had 6 months of really no price action whatsoever. So look, I think if you're new looking at the market, I think you can look at different projects and say, look, yes, Bitcoin's at an all-time high. I think there's bullish opportunities there, but there are a lot of good projects with good use cases that are far away from when they were at an all-time high, and those merit consideration.
David, Josh, let's plow into a little of the details of that. David, we haven't done this in a little bit, but I wanted to start with you. When I look at the price action for Ethereum, I kind of feel like there's some kind of headwind to it. At a use case level, is that headwind caused by like Solana, Cardano from a use case perspective? Is it lack of staking at some of the ETFs that are ETH ETFs? What are your thoughts about that kind of drag on Ether price?
Well, clearly the lack of staking in the Ether ETFs is a big problem, and it makes them less competitive. And it's unfortunate that that was the only way they were approved. One of my hopes is in this new administration that ETFs that allow for staking are approved, and then the product would really more represent what people's expectations are with Ethereum. I also will tell you, Ron, that I think as Bitcoin hits an all-time high, that people will start looking at Ethereum as the other token that they can buy in an ETF wrapper, and will start allocating money towards Ethereum. So we could see, instead of 100% Bitcoin for that part of the allocation, it could be 75% Bitcoin, 25% Ethereum, or some combination of that. And again, the last thing I want to reiterate that we've all talked about, is that the wirehouses, are still on the sidelines. And so that maybe it's a January thing, but there's still a lot of liquidity that people want to put to work that they can't in their traditional wirehouse accounts.
David, really good points. Appreciate it. Josh, let me pull you into this Solana conversation. Again, we're not recommending any particular tokens, but I do want to go back to the election conversation and the SEC. The three of us know there are ETF applications for other cryptos, including Solana. Josh, I won't wager with you. I'm clearly a bad wagerer on anything, but would you imagine a Solana ETF under a new administration?
So without speaking specifically about Solana, I would say, because I am aware also of other potential crypto spot ETFs that are being considered, I would say, to my mind, the chances went way up relative to where they were prior to the election. So I think to the extent that we do see a change in enforcement strategy, remember, we haven't seen, and maybe this is for the best. Well, I'm sure it's for the best, or I believe it's for the best. But we've been very critical of the SEC saying, hey, but you haven't tried to actually bring suit against any of these token projects. You've only gone after the platforms. Well, maybe that's for the best, right? Maybe in terms of getting something through, not having ongoing litigation driven by the SEC against token projects that the SEC may have alleged involved the offer and sale of securities. Perhaps that could be a boon, especially if the direction's changing in the background. What do you guys think?
You go ahead, Ron. I'll tell you after.
I agree. And by the way, I want to point out, David, notice how kind Josh is to me, because I'll ask a question about a specific token. She will immediately say, not going to talk about that token. Well, let me tell you what I think. Very, very clever. No, Josh, David, I agree with you. I mean, when you look at the applications, again, I don't want to minimize the level of detail required. We all remember Bitcoin ETF, spot ETF application, Ether spot ETF application, where a lot of the rejection of that in the beginning was predicated on, are there market surveillance agreements? How do we make sure there's no price manipulation? The mechanics of how regulated spot ETF operates. And truth be told, we don't know that those exist make up a token that might have an ETF application, or Solana, or some of the others. So Josh, to your point, there's a lot more than just, hey, the current SEC chair is gone, things are going to be great. Maybe, yeah, but there's still work that needs to be done in the background. David, am I wrong?
I'm going to take a different take. Well, I agree with both of you. I think what I had said previously, when somebody asked about on our podcast about what I thought about it, the odds of a Solana ETF, and I said, if the administration stayed in place, I was very bearish about the idea of that. But now, look, if it was decided to not pursue any further proceedings in the Ripple case, I think an XRP ETF in 2025 is eminently possible. I think a Solana ETF this year is eminently possible now that we're going to have somebody else running be the chairperson of the SEC, and also a mandate from the executive branch that they want the crypto ecosystem here to flourish in the US. So again, I'm not talking about the merits of a Solana ETF or the merits of an XRP ETF, but on a regulatory and practical level, I see a pathway for those to potentially be ETFs in 2025. The more interesting ones, come if someone wants a basket of meme coins or a Doge ETF, and at some point there'll be some sort of reckoning around that. But I would say the odds for a Solana and XRP ETF in 2025, depending on the resolution of the litigation that exists, especially with XRP, are much, much higher than they would be if Chair Gensler and the Democrats held control.
David, Josh, thank you both so much. I think all three of us have received, I've received multiple text messages from colleagues with just Doge with like 40 exclamation points after it. I'm not recommending Doge for anyone in the audience. David, Josh, we've only got a couple of minutes. There's obviously going to be continued election conversation, certainly through the balance of the year. Josh, before you head to the next Gulfstream trip, what are you going to be focusing on in the coming couple of weeks?
So other than work and catching up on, reading in the industry, I've been actually watching a lot in terms of who may be the next SEC chair. So I think one of the names that's been batted around a lot in multiple publications, including MSNBC, but also the New York Post and other places, is Rich Farley, who's a partner at Kramer Levin. I've also seen, I believe, mentioned Norm Champ, Dan Gallagher, Commissioner Uyeda, Heath Tarbert, Paul Atkins, Robert Stebbins. Some are saying that Rich Farley and Norm Champ are the at least in the lead. I don't know if that's the case, but that's what I've seen. One thing though that I haven't been seeing as much, although I did hear this much more when immediately after the election, is where in these articles is Hester Peirce?
Yes.
Is Hester Peirce under consideration? Does Hester Peirce even want to be SEC commissioner? But I think that's something really to think about. I'd love to hear your views on that. I know you just said what will I be doing for the next week, but I'm really curious about.
I'll weigh in a little bit, Josh. I'm a little surprised. Dan Gallagher's name was raised pretty substantially for a week or so, and that seems to have kind of again, I'm not going to prediction markets, David, but that seems to have come off the top of the consideration list, and I don't know why. Josh, David, did you have any thoughts about it?
Candidly, I've been enjoying a little bit of my vacation, so I haven't followed it as closely. But what I recall reading is that Hester Peirce wants to stay on as a commissioner, but did not want to be in the role of chairperson. I think Commissioner Uyeda, I think, would be interested in being commissioner or chairperson. I like the idea. I like the idea of Dan Gallagher as somebody who's been really through it and understands it. And I think he was a SEC commissioner in the past. I haven't had a chance to read up on some of the other names, which I will. But, my hope would be someone who's really familiar with our industry. But again, we have to be clear, like our industry is only one small part of all the mandate of the SEC. And whoever is commissioner really has to be able to have their hands around, all of it. Yep. So, I'm hopeful that we'll get somebody that will handle, and work with our industry constructively. And, look, like there are a lot of cases that are out there, Josh. You mentioned it before, but, we have Binance, we have Coinbase, we have Kraken. We have major market cases that are out there that need to be resolved, and what resolution looks like, and what comes out of that. So I'll be looking at that. I'll be definitely looking at the price action. I do think that, again, we're not giving investment advice. I do think we could see, maybe 90,000 shortly. I do think at some point we're going to take a breather. And I think it's not clear to me when that is, but I do think we will see like a sell-off as part of this part of this bull market. So I do think we will take a breather at some point. But I'm really interested to see, is Ethereum going to kind of keep pace with Bitcoin and the gains that we see? Or is there a part where, Ethereum really starts to run up faster than Bitcoin because they are so much lower, because it is so much, lower than its all-time high. So I'm really going to look at some price structure, enjoy being out in the Southwest for a few days and being on vacation. And like Josh, very curious to see who will be the SEC chair, who's going to be in some of the top positions in the cabinet. I think it's really going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
David, thanks so much. Josh, as you know, my nightmare scenario is that Bitcoin hits 125,000 on January 1st. And either way, it's a great steak dinner for the three of us. But David, I'm assuming you'll be hitting the links out in Arizona as well, correct?
Actually, no, I'm not. I'm not a golfer, Ron, but I did have an excellent steak dinner to put up as a bar for the other restaurants in Manhattan.
He's just
I went
making
to
it
this-
harder, Josh.
I went to this restaurant, La Mer, in Scottsdale, and it was really excellent. So I think there's going to be a high bar for our New York
Yeah.
restaurants. But I think the alternate irony for me, Ron, would be, we hit about like 120, 122 right at New Year's Day
Yeah.
or New Year's Eve, and then we did in the first week of January hit 125. I would see the irony in that.
I've been trying to push David for an Outback Steakhouse, and he immediately declined, Josh. Thank you both. We're going to have to leave it there. For everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for being part of this. If you've got additional questions for David or Josh or I, please email us info@wsba.co. Thank you so much, David and Josh, for our Monday post-election special. We will be back on Friday, and we will leave it there. Have a great rest of the week, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.